Hello, you're listening to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DVS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist. Welcome to our 65th episode. Today, we have the pleasure of having with us a person who spent his career at the heart of multilateral work. Martin Mühleisen is a former director at the International Monetary Fund. Between 2017 and 2020, Martin was responsible for the IMF strategic direction and the design, implementation, and evaluation of fund policies. He helped develop the IMF's policy positions on fintech and digital currencies, the renegotiations of the new arrangements to borrow, as well as the IMF's rapid response to the COVID-19 crisis. All of these issues we'll try to touch on during the course of this conversation. Before that, from 2013 to 17, Martin was the chief of staff to Christine Lagarde, who was then the IMF's managing director. His tenure coincided with the negotiation of new IMF programs with Ukraine and Greece, as well as the IMF's rapid response to the African Ebola crisis. So as you can see, he really has been at the heart of multilateral work for years. During his 27 years at the IMF, Martin did all that and much more. I personally had the pleasure of working with him on Japan and a tiny island called the Marshall Islands. So let's listen to his views now that he's outside the IMF. Martin Mühleisen, welcome to Kopi Time.
Thank you so much, Taimur. It's a pleasure being on, and it's good to see you. We have many memories together.
Indeed, Martin. Let's start with a tough question. Let's hear your assessment of the policy response to the COVID crisis so far. What has been done right, or perhaps where we have gone a bit too far, in your view?
Well, I mean, if you look back where we were a bit more than a year ago when this whole thing started and there was all this uncertainty, and where we are now, you got to give policymakers a lot of credit. And that means both on the fiscal side and on the monetary side. I think they've done all the right things that we kind of learned over the years since the Great Depression. So supporting the economy with fiscal means, providing liquidity, providing support from the central bank side, and also internationally. I think the IMF at the time, also the other international financial institutions, really tried to help as much as they could for countries that didn't have the firepower to do it on their own. And while some people say, of course, that much more would have been needed, I think within their mandates and to the extent possible, the institutions very broadly have reacted very well. I would mention that, for example, on the IMF side, the members have agreed to this SDR allocation, which has brought a lot of liquidity to, especially to poorer countries that need it most. I don't want to go into shortcomings on global vaccination and the like. I'm sure more could have been done there, but we're talking about financial institutions at the moment. And I don't think it was necessarily a question of financial support, but the logistics and the willingness of people to share vaccines, I think were much more important there. We should also realize, of course, that this has come at a cost, which are more long-term. So on the fiscal side, countries that have had the firepower to really ramp up their spending and go into big deficits for a while, by and large have to cope with the demographic developments going forward. So Europe, Japan, the US also at some point, they all have unfunded liabilities on their pension side, and especially on healthcare. And with that now ratcheting up across the industrialized world, especially, dealing with these will become even more a priority in the next couple of years when the aging really kicks in. It's even been accelerated a little bit because many people have retired earlier. So that's going to be an issue that will come to the fore pretty soon. Entitlement reform is never easy to deal with, but that's the cost of having had this room now and having used it. And on the monetary side, there's of course the issue of asset prices and to some extent the not explicit but implicit fiscal dominance, where you have to be really careful about rates because it may affect fiscal sustainability in some countries, and we can talk a bit later. But that asset kind of valuation has led to even wider inequalities, as in fact it has been this working from home versus service workers inequality already. And we need to deal with it at some point, I think, as societies. And there are some attempts going. The Biden administration is trying to do some in Europe. I think they're thinking about it. But that's a key issue of our times, even before the crisis. And the response has kind of, in a way, reinforced that. So we need to deal with that too.
Sure, Martin, and as you said, I mean, we will touch on inequality and the monetary policy conundrum a little later in the podcast. I remember the last time you and I spoke, you used the phrase ratcheting up in the context of policy response. So can you think of, certain sort of responses where this ratcheting up perhaps is in danger of going too far?
Well, I mean, there will be countries that one's monetary policy eventually tightens, and I'm not saying it has to tighten right now in a interest rate sense. Will get into difficulties because sustainability is to some extent predicated on interest rates staying low for quite some time. And I don't want to name names, but both in developing economies and in emerging markets and low-income countries, you have a lot of countries that are kind of, out in the outer edges of debt to GDP ratios. And while I don't necessarily think that we're yet out of this underlying savings investment kind of play that Larry Summers, for example, has termed the secular stagnation, that will keep interest rates low for some time, that in the short term and maybe even medium term, there will be some difficulties when interest rates eventually will go up some before they perhaps normalize again. And so that will kind of give some countries difficulties. And then there is the issue of, how do we ever come back from these high debt levels? I mentioned the unfunded liabilities. So there's going to be this pressure of ever larger debt increases unless we raise taxes or cut benefits. And that's never really popular, especially in those days with social media and populist tendencies in many countries. Putting in policies that will really affect people in their wallet is never going to be easy for any political party.
Martin, I was at a conference, and I'm going to name names yesterday, on India. And the question came up that India's debt GDP ratio jumped by 20% during the course of the pandemic, went from high 60s to now almost 90% of GDP. But the basic thrust of the conversation among the discussants was that a country that has on a steady state double-digit nominal GDP growth rate and single-digit nominal interest rate on its debt, not an issue. Even if it doesn't run a very large primary surplus, just the big growth interest differential would allow debt GDP to be stable or even decline in the medium term, provided growth comes. But the other, part of that conversation is the high nominal GDP growth rate, which comes for a country like India having on average, 4 or 5% inflation. So even for the industrial economies, Martin, that's one way of dealing with debt, right? Allow for higher inflation. And we are hearing a lot about flexible inflation targeting, allowing the economy to run super hot. So this, in my view, going back to the phrase of ratcheting up, there's certain policy trends that have become very strong. In the past, around the issue of deflation, there were all these, head scratching around how we can get credible policies that will allow inflation to be normal. And for that, you have to overshoot for a while. So that's one theme I want to hear a bit of where you think. And also issues like Build Back Better, which the Biden administration is trying to pass a law, which not only includes investment in hard infrastructure, but also in soft infrastructure, allowing people to have greater labor market flexibility and so on. So a couple of these trends, I suppose people were talking about before the pandemic, and now have become quite accentuated. So on these issues, I just want to see what you think.
So yes, in some countries where growth is naturally still high, that are a bit kind of slower on the demographic curve, like India, for example, maybe there's some hope that higher debt levels will be sustainable. But as you say, it depends on growth prospects. And one of my first jobs in the IMF was actually to look after India for a couple of years with others, of course, together. And that's when they just came out of their program. And then that kind of, happened because policies were not right. There was no good investment climate and all that. India is very different now, and I'm very optimistic for it. But good policies need to continue, and one needs to be able to reap the fruits of technology. Productivity needs to stay high. And that's a challenge for all countries, whether it's emerging markets like India or developing economies. In terms of Build Back Better and inflation, I think it's important to realize that when we talk about climate and the challenges coming from that side, which we now have to really figure in much more than we ever did, of course. The challenge for all economies will be to accommodate a drastic change in relative prices eventually. So in other words, if we're serious about fighting climate change and we want to phase out carbon intensive technologies, some of it has to be happening through the price level. It's kind of happening right now implicitly, but that has more to do, I think, with supply shortages and some policies that are being implemented by some of the oil producers, for example. But eventually it's going to happen, and renewables will become cheaper. But that shift in demand and that shift in the productive structure will affect a lot of companies, a lot of people, countries, and to allow for that in an efficient way, we need to let the market do some of its job. And because of that, and the fact that price deflation is always difficult to achieve, we will probably see some, I don't want to say temporary or transitory, but some structural inflation for a while that is reflected by just some prices that have to go up in order for this rebalancing to happen. Then we also have a digital challenge with a lot of sectors facing existential problems because of the competition from their digital counterparts. That will also lead to some price changes and a lot of shifts in employment from one sector into others. And to accommodate all that, economies need to be able to function. We should be very wary of price controls and price caps and all that. But it may imply somewhat higher inflation on balance compared to before. Now, if that is all happening within a 2% kind of or 3% range, as opposed to between 0 and 1 in some advanced economies, there's nothing wrong with that. But of course, the big danger is that we're ending up for some time in the 3, 4, 5% range, and then expectations start to shift. Maybe labor wage demands will go up and remain high. So then we're in a bit of a conundrum. I don't see it at the moment. I mean, unions, have no longer the role that they played in the 70s. And then there's this whole argument about savings and investment, the relative prices there. So I don't see a fundamental upward trend in inflation, but it's certainly going to be a feature that we have to deal with for a while, and that has political implications. So I hope I'm making sense, but what I'm saying is that we're in a time of very strong structural change, and that structural change needs to be kind of accompanied by price changes, and we need to let these prices go while keeping, of course, in mind the overall stability of the economy.
It's a very interesting thesis, Martin. In the last century or so, major structural changes, whether it was transportation-related revolution that we had, or the IT revolution that we have had in the last 20, 30 years, or various breakthroughs in technology, have been associated with deflationary outcomes. Things have gone down in prices, at least in quality-adjusted terms. But what you're saying, and I fully agree with you, that climate transition is not going to be one of those, because to shift the economy away from conventional to renewables, one would have to see some relative price adjustments, and that would be almost very, very likely inflationary, whether through policy or through demand switching. And that's a very different set of challenges, even from a monetary policy perspective. But Martin, among the changes that you just talked about, and you talked about climate change, and I want to later on talk in the context of monetary policy. But for the time being, the other big trend that everybody talks about is inequality. Now, I'm sitting here in Singapore, and I look at between country inequality, which in my perspective has actually narrowed. thanks to China and India's rise over the last 2-3 decades. But within country inequality, even among these countries, have worsened. And of course, in the case of the Western economies, that is very much visible. So have you been thinking about this issue, and do you have certain insights for us to take away?
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. And whoever is interested in that should read Branko Milanovic's work, including his latest update on the numbers. So yes, it's great to see across country inequality declining. Global inequality, if you want, is declining. Big effect of that is China, of course, but also other countries. But what worries me and has worried me for a while is the within country inequality. I already mentioned it earlier when we talked about the asset price developments. It's getting to the core of society, right? I mean, our whole economic model, and I don't want to say capitalist model, I mean, any economic model, even the one in China, if you want, is threatened if a large part of the population doesn't partake in the gains in the income gains that are achieved. So that has very strong political implications. And we have to look at climate and inequality somewhat together, because the fight against climate change needs to be politically sustainable too. It's not just the sustainable debt and sustainable climate policies, it's the political sustainability of that fight. And if we see the inequality widening, we're never going to get this long-term support for policies that are necessary to deal with the issue. Let me give you an example. We're always talking about, the Trump phenomenon in the US. There's a very interesting analysis that breaks down the last elections that were won by Biden in the US into which counties voted for the one or the other candidate, and how are these counties connected with the carbon economy. So you have the carbon economy and the knowledge economy to kind of polarize a little bit. And in the carbon side, you of course have transportation, mining and all that, but also to some extent chemicals and related industries. And lo and behold, the support that Trump received was very closely aligned with the counties that were dependent on the carbon economy. So, that tells you a lot about what the potential conflicts will be. And I don't think it's only in the US. It's intermingled with the difference between rural and urban areas. We've seen some regional kind of factors playing out in Europe, for example, in Germany, in the UK. But we should not be under the illusion that countries can sustain their climate policies if it means that a large share of the population will be driven out of work or will have difficulties keeping their house warm and all that. So inequality and climate are very closely related. And we also will face the difficulty of compensating those that are losing from climate policies, as we have already failed in a way to do those who lost from the globalization and the trade liberalization in the past years, right? Every country has some programs in place to help regions that lose factories and manufacturing jobs. Here in the US, you have trade facilitation policies. In Europe, you have the social safety net, and in other countries. But where are we? We do have a lot of regions that face that structural change and really look much, much worse than they did in the 60s and 70s. So these policies to accommodate structural change have not been very successful. And now we're facing it on a perhaps even bigger scale. And, we should not be under the illusion that we're going to do much better this time. So yes, financial support will help. Unemployment benefits, social benefits, health, childcare support, of course, but it's also really about employment and just compensating people who lost their jobs and not giving them new employment chances will not help. Mobility is difficult these days because of the housing markets everywhere. So we need to really think about more targeted support to regions, cities that suffer from this structural change. That I think is nowhere to be seen in sufficient amount, and needs to be much more coordinated planning between regional authorities, the central government, and so forth. But that's really for economists to explore further. I think there's not enough work done on that area, but we need to face it. Otherwise, we're going to end up with policies that are subpar, both economically and for the climate.
And could boomerang back. So a well-intentioned policy of climate mitigation may end up making those policies untenable if they're politically very, very unpopular. I think French Premier Macron found that out during the Gilets Jaunes protests, where it seemed like it was just a simple measure to pass through, and then a hornet's nest was opened up as a result. So, Martin, I want to stay on the issue of inequality and climate change, but perhaps a different angle, which is central banking. Increasingly, we hear from central bankers, their views on inequality and climate change. I remember a few years ago, this is before Jerome Powell, I think Janet Yellen was the Fed chair at that time, and they were talking about the need to prolong the cycle, because as you keep the cycle intact longer and longer, it's the disadvantaged in the society who get the marginal jobs, and therefore a link between successful monetary policy and inequality was made. What's your view? Inequality and climate change, do central banks need to take the lead on these issues?
I mean, in general, I believe that central banks should stay very closely within their mandate. Climate change and inequality really are societal challenges, and for that we have a political process. The danger is that if central banks are being seen as favoring one side in that political dispute, they not only lose credibility, but also, whenever political fortunes shift, they may be misused by one or the other party then for their own political purposes. And that really introduces an element of instability that goes right to the heart of the success that we have achieved on the monetary side over these many years and decades. So I'd be cautious to give central banks any role that goes beyond their mandate. Now, having said that, of course, it is within their mandate to react to climate change and inequality in certain regards. I mean, central banks need to understand what inequality and especially climate change do to the economy, to the monetary transmission process, to their targets that they have under the law. There we see slightly different one for the US, which is really about growth and inflation, if you want. So they need to worry a bit more about that, whereas in other countries you have a more narrow monetary part. On the climate side, clearly the big issue right now, not yet acute, but coming, is financial stability. It's in part because of natural disasters that are now occurring more frequently, what it does to the asset quality. But it is also regarding the transitional costs of policies. So tax increases, for example, what do they do to the monetary transmission process, to inflation and so forth? So central banks, of course, need to understand how to deal with this. And for those who are interested, I would recommend reading a document just put out by the BIS yesterday, where they put out some principles for financial supervision, regarding climate change. How should central banks deal with it? What should be the approaches and so forth? They also done some nice background work on the methodologies that should be followed. So I think that's a pretty straightforward case because it's part of the overall economic and financial process. And then there's the issue of inequality. If central banks have within their mandate different tools to choose to kind of achieve certain actions, they may well keep in mind what it does to the overall distribution and how it affects, again, the inflationary process. So within that, I'm all for it, of course. I mean, we do want to have maximum effect, of course, positive effect on the economy of all the things that central banks do. But again, I'd be very leery of giving them, or by that matter, international institutions, any role or let them adopt any role that is not really theirs, that is belonging firmly in the political area.
So let me push on this a little more, Martin. The reason I personally feel a little partial towards central banks taking, some degree of leadership, and I want you to sort of, tell me where that falls apart, is that central banks tend to be a little more stable in their policy mandates and their policy action, although the governor of a central bank or the chair in the case of the Fed is appointed by the pleasure of the president, but by and large, the leadership is a fairly stable one and seems to outlast the political cycle. Whereas the Ministry of Finance of a country, changes quite dramatically as soon as the government changes. So an institution that seems to be around with a slightly longer time horizon, things like inequality, climate change, which are of course generational issues, I sometimes wonder whether they are in a better position to deal with it because they seem to be a little less volatile. But you seem to think that politics plays such a big role in these issues that we should not give it to apolitical organizations.
Yeah, that's my belief. I mean, that doesn't mean that the central bank governor or officials cannot voice their own personal views here or there about what should be done. But in terms of the actions, I'd be very careful. So, for example, should central banks kind of get involved in issues of what kind of bonds, for example, should be bought, or how should they rate exposure to carbon emitting industries by their banks? Again, it's a very difficult subject, and they should well evaluate the risks that can come from the policies, but to the extent that there are normative judgments going in. So, for example, the central bank deciding that it's not ethical to do this or that, I'd be very cautious, because again, these issues can be reversed, and once the institutions get into these political fights, that can be very bitter. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. As I said, this is a very long fight against climate change. It's not to be won a year or two from now. It will last 15, 20 years or longer to really get the breakthrough. And in that time, there will be many issues popping up that have nothing to do with climate: financial crises, banking problems, the usual business cycles. And we need strong institutions to get through all that. And if they get compromised because they're being seen as, belonging to this party or that party, then they may not be able to do the right things that they need to do. And I'd be very careful of crossing that line.
Oh, point well taken. All right, I'm not going to let go of the issue, but I want to talk about it in the context of multilateral organizations. I'm going to quote from an article that you wrote for the Atlantic Council. I believe it came up last month. And you wrote, some observers are concerned about the IMF moving too far away from its traditional area of expertise. Their worries are justified. Progress on climate and development can only be achieved via strong jobs growth and a healthy global economy. The fund therefore needs to stay focused on its global stability mandate. So Martin, expand on that a little bit, please.
So it comes from the exact same thought that we just discussed. The IMF has a certain job to do, and while it is fashionable right now for everybody to try and do something on the climate side and other issues, it's going to be a long slog, and countries will be in difficulties at some point. As I mentioned before, there are countries with high debt levels that may not be able to kind of continue their policies without sharper adjustments once things hopefully settle down after COVID. And the IMF needs to be there and help. And to do that, it needs to have the expertise, the reputation, the people that can help in these situations. That is a skill that needs to be maintained by the IMF. What I'm a bit concerned about is that, let me actually step back. I mean, what is the key job of the IMF? Just to recall, it's helping countries that need financial assistance with good programs, well-designed programs. And in order to prevent these things from happening in the first place, it needs to do good surveillance, whether it's country surveillance, talking to the authorities, or whether it's multilateral surveillance. Now, financial stability and help on climate and inequality can sometimes kind of collide with each other. For example, if you have a program where you need to really help a country kind of adjust its policies, but at the same time, you also want the country to get the country a lot of money to finance climate programs. Well, if the two are tied together as they are in the latest ideas that come out of the fund, then there's a conflict of interest. To stop the program because they are not doing some of the policies that they should do, well, then you're also stopping the support for climate policies. So are you kind of going ahead with a weaker program because you want to maintain the climate projects, or you kind of stop the whole thing? That is a conflict of interest. And there is a lot of overlap in this area between the IMF and other international institutions. And I would argue that we should keep it separate so that the institutions that are really having an interest in climate projects do that, whereas the fund stays more or less focused on stability. There is, of course, room for the IMF, and they should do that, to analyze climate policies in the surveillance context. What are the macroeconomic implications for that? Can a country do all that, what they want? Do they need more money? Then the IMF can always kind of help get that by raising this on the international level. And all that, this is a good thing. But the fund has also been tasked to do a lot of other things over the last couple of years. So, for example, there's a huge operation going on in helping countries strengthen their governance, which is, again, a good thing. It's to increase transparency. It's to help with anti-corruption laws and the like. Very important in the Ukraine case, for example. That was a good example. They're also being absorbed quite a bit with debt issues. How to resolve debt, how to support the G20 common framework. Then there is the whole area of social spending. So you could add a lot of kind of very good projects that have been piled onto the IMF staff because they have a reputation of being very, as you remember, very focused and deliver very quickly on issues. But it's leading to an overburdening of the staff. And there is also generational change now at the fund. I mean, lots of people are retiring, people of my age that have come into the fund at the 90s. And I'm just concerned that if the fund doesn't stick with its kind of core issues, it gets drawn into too many directions and it loses the coherence and the analytical power that it's always been appreciated for, and the staff has been very proud of. People always say the staff is the IMF's biggest asset. And I see it kind of being whittled away in terms of the quality if there's not a stronger focus. And most of all, the fund should be ready to deploy its resources where its mandate is, and not risk losing its legitimacy if there are kind of weaker programs that don't work quite well, or where we have then even arrears to the IMF. So it's important to kind of keep focused on the core issue.
Yeah, I don't think debt crises and banking sector crises are going to become unfashionable and go away. And therefore, I think as cycles surely reassert themselves, the fund staff will see them get busy with solving the next, fire out there in the financial crisis world. And that, of course, will, I think, and should take precedence over all the other work that the fund may or may not take on. Okay, Martin, well said. Couple of questions, but before I go there, I realized that, when we're talking about sustainability of debt and the risk of crisis, I forgot to ask you one question. Look, 10, 12 years ago, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, there were some people who were being Cassandras and felt that the explosion in debt at that time and the large deficit spending were going to create major financial problems, which did not pan out. In fact, interest rates kept on going down, and countries that actually ended up with higher debt to GDP were actually spending less on interest as a share of GDP in the 2010s. And as we speak right now, borrowing has never been cheaper. So how long can this trend last? Do you see a time when interest rates turn around as opposed to the last 40 years when they have just gradually declined?
So that's an interesting question. as I said, I think that the fundamental forces that were in place the last couple of years or decades even, that kept interest rates low, are still in place. So I would expect, after some unwinding of stimulus and some increase in interest rates, to kind of, stay in an area that is going to be still favorable for most economies to continue, maybe with a bit of adjustment. But the longer term trends, of course, are such that potential growth in the world economy is going to slow down somewhat. And here, I would recommend people read the work by Goodhart and Bradan, The Great Demographic Reversal. It's a very interesting piece that, in a way, captures the broad trends that will govern potential growth going forward. And the question has to be at some point whether all that debt that's out there will eventually be repaid by whom, right? So you have this ratcheting up of debt, and we're saying that, well, saving will kind of be larger than investment for quite some time, but can we kind of extend this for years and years and years? Or do we at some point kind of see a bit of a reversal, that really we see an older generation globally that is consuming more than relatively speaking than what's happening now, and at the same time we still have to invest because of climate change, and we still have to do other expenditures, and will this eventually kind of just overburden the kind of working force? So you have this kind of global aging process that they're describing. They describe how it was beneficial as long as China opened up and many other developing countries. But with the exception of India, all countries are kind of entering the aging phase fairly soon. And there's also other developments that may kind of affect that. Now, they may be a bit on the pessimistic side. And so you have this kind of battle between different forces. Whether we see the savings surplus continuing, or whether we see eventually potential growth kind of slowing down to an extent that we can't finance this anymore. We should also allow for some potentially big productivity gains that could kick in because of the digital economy that's still going on. We haven't talked about that for a lot. So between these forces, it's going to be decided. And knowing how good our forecasts were in the past, I don't dare really making any, but we should certainly watch out for signs. For example, Japan has been an interesting case. We've predicted difficulties in Japan for many, many years, as you remember. I remember one paper at some point asked, when will financial Mount Fuji blow its top? And it caused quite a stir. I got a call from Stan Fisher at the time to explain the arithmetic of the Chinese debt situation. And of course, Japan has just kept on going spending, and they've done quite well. But I think the concern there is that eventually Japan may no longer have the current account surplus that it used to have, and then is the whole model still kind of workable? And for the world as a whole, you have to ask at some point, if growth is slowing down, who will come to the rescue of the world? It's certainly not going to be Mars with external demand. So how does this work out? I'm having my doubts that it's all going to work out without some adjustment, but we'll see.
So, Martin, since you brought up the issue of the digital economy, let's talk about that. A few years ago, I think it was Northwestern's Robert Gordon who wrote about this book about rise and fall of American growth, where the argument was made that this entire information technology revolution over the last 30, 40 years have been utterly unimpressive in terms of boosting productivity. So we have technology everywhere except for the TFP number. I myself am compelled by what's happening on the digital space, and I would also like to believe that it would usher in an era of great productivity, pushing up potential GDP growth rate, and perhaps normalizing some of the interest rate trends that we just spoke about. You remain on the optimistic camp?
Yeah, by and large, yes. There's incredible productivity gains in these companies that are running the show at the moment, right? The big tech companies and all that, but also in many other companies that produce things. If you look at it as really a bifurcation with very strong companies leading the way. But the problem is that a lot of people that don't work for these companies don't find jobs anymore that are productive. I mean, you know, to kind of give examples, someone who drives cars or for Uber or drives trucks or works at fast food restaurants or other restaurants, their productivity is not increasing. And so if you shift a large amount of people into that sector, that's going to cancel out some of the gains that you get from the other workers in the other companies. And of course, it reinforces the inequality problem. So I would turn it around and say, if we want to see a healthy society going forward, we have no choice but to raise productivity, which means we need to help people that are not working for the kind of top companies and who will not get into these big paying salaries. We need to help them finding jobs that are better than what they have right now, lift their productivity in a sense. And that will also lead to then an overall productivity gain in the economy. It can be leveraged and facilitated by technology, but the big thing that happened in the early part of the last century with the cars and the industrialization was that it spawned so many jobs that were attached to it, like think of, you know, car repair shops or machine tools and all this kind of thing, that provided room for people to make a living based on kind of contributing to that. Now, when you have such a centralization with code, which is hard to learn for most people, and it's really limited to a smaller amount of the workforce that can do everything for everybody else, you have this natural concentration. And I think that's what we need to overcome. So rather than asking, you know, will it happen or not, I say we should make sure to achieve it. Otherwise, we're going to have difficulties with our overall model down the road.
I really, really like the way you threaded the productivity issue with the inequality and the jobs issue, question, Martin. Yeah, I think the imperative is very, very clear. Couple of questions on the coming debt restructuring. We began the discussion by talking about the burden of debt having gone up, and we may agree or disagree on the trajectory or sustainability of debt in the advanced economies, but in the developing countries with very hard budget constraint, that is clear and present danger. Martin, as sovereign economies start struggling with the burden of debt in the coming years, one possible solution is the IMF can play a central role by selling its gold holding to provide interest rate subsidies or finance multilateral debt write-offs. Would you do that?
No, I don't think so. There are many other ways, and one shouldn't kind of go and kind of you know, chew away from the substance of the international institutions. The IMF has a special financing model. It relies a lot of being able to borrow from central banks, get the funding there. Gold holdings right now are not high relative to the overall outstanding commitments, including a lot of these FCLs that are very big that have been given to some countries. And it also kind of weakens the incentives for countries to comply with the IMF programs if they know that at some point there's going to be a write down of their multilateral claims using IMF gold. So I don't think it's a good idea. Some NGOs have raised it. I think the board would be very split about it, and there's also technical issues that would delay anything for quite some time. So it's not a good fix. I would really stay away from that. Having said that, the fund can play a really important role in this, and it has already in the past years. There's a very kind of elaborate framework for IMF programs to deal with debt, and it's been hampered lately by the problem of China and other kind of quote unquote new lenders kind of falling in line with the established rules that exist in the Paris Club that works with the IMF on restructuring countries' debt. And it's, I think, here where we need to look into. So, for example, the IMF is currently doing a review of its lending into arrears policy. And that provides tools for the IMF to lend if countries default on certain countries, in part because, or lenders in part because there is no forthcoming restructuring. And in order to be able for the IMF to lend, it can essentially ignore these non-payments and still move ahead with the program, which forces then these creditors to eventually fall in line, which has been a very good policy. But the crux of the matter is that countries that sit on the IMF board and that have official claims on program countries usually work in the Paris Club. And since China is not part of that, they had to find ways to accommodate China and still make progress on some of this lending. And that happens in the G20 Common Front that is currently being kind of put together, tested, explored. There are 3 countries ahead of in the process right now. These are largely developing countries, but it will set a very important standard. The reasons for why China is not in the Paris Club are to some extent political, but they also are relating to China's internal coordination problems as a creditor. China has a lot of institutions and as well as official creditors that lend to a country, but unlike the US, Germany, Japan, OECD countries, they have little knowledge still internally of who exactly lends what to whom, let alone a way to coordinate, for example, debt relief when it is necessary. Just as an example, I read the other day a paper by Bräutigam and others from SAIS. Zambia, as an example, deals with 29 large Chinese conglomerates that have done construction work, mostly for roads and infrastructure. And they deal with 18 different large Chinese lenders. And these lenders are not coordinated. So a debt restructuring for Zambia would be very difficult to achieve because whereas the Paris Club is quite efficient, China doesn't quite know yet how to deal with these kind of international issues. And it takes a long time. So here the IMF can help. IMF policies need to be strong, they need to be observed, there needs to be some hard-nosed decisions about when to lend and not to lend, so as to provide incentives for everybody to kind of go along with it, because in the end, if a country defaults and creditors don't get their money for some time, then everybody suffers. So there is a common interest to contribute to a program by the IMF for both private and official creditors. And this has worked in the past quite well. And I'm confident that eventually these new creditors, including China, will understand the mechanics of it and the advantages of participating. And then hopefully we'll see how we can deal with this possibly large challenge down the road. I mean, there's a separate issue of getting the private creditors involved. And there, I think a bit more pressure from the official side would help. The IMF can't do it. It can't really interfere with creditor-debtor relationships. But, countries will eventually need to come together and lean a bit on the private sector to contribute to debt restructuring.
So Martin, it's really interesting. I think a lot of people, sitting here in Asia, our caricature of China is, it's a supremely well-coordinated economy, centralized planning. But, I think people will be surprised by what you just said, that even the central authorities in China don't have full visibility on, how much debt has gone out from China to a particular borrower out there, and that itself becomes a major source of complication when debt restructuring comes in. I want to latch on to that final point you made about private creditor involvement. So you will, of course, remember, Martin, that when Anne Kruger was the first deputy managing director of the IMF, there was a huge attempt to create some sort of a debt workout program. I think it was called SDRM at that time, and it didn't really go anywhere. And then we've had multiple crises since then, and probably have another one coming in the next few years, where again, a large amount of debt has to be restructured. I mean, have we come up with a decent way of bringing the private sector in, or is it still very ad hoc and rather painful?
There's no systematic way in that sense, but I mean, as I said, what happens is that if a country defaults on its private sector creditors, which happens sometimes because they just run out of reserves, the IMF can go ahead and provide them with money and not force them to repay. Again, it's between the country and its creditors how they want to structure that relationship. The IMF can't get into that, but the IMF kind of could say, well, as long if you don't pay your private creditors, that's your thing, but we will deal with you so that you can finance your basic expenditures, social expenditures, and the like. That usually brings the private sector creditors to the table. Maybe sometimes takes a while, but it's worked in countries as diverse as Greece and Argentina. And what we haven't seen, of course, is that the private sector hasn't played along with the debt standstill as part of this DSSI that was called for right at the big pandemic. That's a bit of a different thing because official creditors just delayed their debt payments a bit. It would have been nice if people have contributed. But when it comes to hard-nosed restructurings, there's usually enough kind of organizational heft within some of the larger creditors to get everybody around the table and agree on terms that are then, should be broadly comparable to the official restructuring, of course. It's made more difficult by the emergence of new actors there. So hedge funds, commodity traders, pension funds, lots of new players, not just the banks anymore. And so it's going to be a bit more complicated to arrange everybody around the table. There's also the problem of commodity-backed debt. So in some cases, countries basically, guarantee certain creditors that they're going to have first access on whatever commodities a country produces. That's a problem because it may take quite a bit of chunk of revenue out of the debt restructuring process and complicates treating everybody on the same terms. But in principle, private sector has found a way to contribute. It's more, I think, on the official side, also because of geopolitical challenges, to get everybody kind of on board for it, which is why an SDRM just wouldn't work at the moment. But in the end, it's an economic and financial problem where everybody benefits if they come to a solution. So I'm hopeful, as I said. Nobody wants to lose money for ideological purposes. So this common framework is something that needs to be explored. And, if one day we don't have a Paris club, but we have a Singapore club where China participates in that essentially works like the Paris club, well, so be it. It would be great. But we need to have an understanding how this works. There needs to be much more transparency also on the debt side, especially with some of these new creditors. They need to kind of provide more data. We need to have a clearer situation what countries are really in. You can have fair negotiations, and then you can come to good decisions for creditors and the country alike.
Well, that's an important part of the financial architecture that awaits us, no doubt about that. Martin, it's been such a wonderful tour de force. I thank you very, very much for your time and insights in this conversation.
It was great, Temur, and congratulations on the series. It's really a pleasure listening to your podcast. Apart from hearing your voice, it's also very interesting, and I'm grateful you gave me a part in it. Thank you.
The pleasure is all ours, and I learned so much from hearing from people like you. So thank you again, Martin. Thanks also to our listeners. Kopi Time was produced by Martin Taki. Daisy Sharma and Violet Lee provided additional assistance. It is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 65 episodes of Kopi Time are available on YouTube and also on all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.